Welcome to Chapter 12. The South Expands, Slavery in Society, 1800 to 1860. Now let's get started. The domestic slave trade. The Upper South exports slaves. By 1817, the Southern plantation system was rapidly expanding, as was the demand for slave labor. By 1860, the slave frontier extended to Texas. The federal government played a major role in this expansion of slavery by securing Louisiana from the French in 1803, removing Indians from the southeastern states in the 1830s, and annexing Texas and Mexican territories in the 1840s. To cultivate this vast area, white planters turned first to Africa for slaves and then to the Chesapeake region. Throughout the Old South, the African-American population was growing rapidly from natural increases, an average of 27% per decade, creating a surplus of slave laborers. High demand for slaves contributed to the creation of the domestic slave trade, or the massive forced migration of 1 million African Americans from the upper to the lower South. By 1860, a majority of African Americans lived and worked in the New South. The internal slave trade took two forms. Owners transferred their slaves from old to new plantations in the Southwest, or traders sold slaves southward. The coastal trade system ran through the Atlantic seaports to the sugar plantations of Louisiana. Northern abolitionists condemned this highly visible slave trade. The sugar fields of Louisiana acquired a bad reputation because disease, overwork, and brutal treatment resulted in a high death rate. The more extensive but less visible route for the domestic slave trade was the inland system that followed rivers and roads. The majority of the human cargo came from the Chesapeake and Carolinas. The domestic slave trade allowed cotton and sugar planters to prosper and improved the profit margin for slave owners from the Upper South. What was the impact on blacks? The impact on slave families was profound, emphasizing their vulnerability as movable personal property. The capital invested in slave property strengthened the Southern economic system. The sale of a slave became a form of discipline as well as punishment, resulting in the breaking up of countless families and destroying 1 in 4 marriages. Nearly 1/3 of all slave children under the age of 14 were separated from their parents through the domestic slave trade. Despite sales, slave families remained strong. Many slave marriages remained unbroken, and the majority of children lived with one or both parents until puberty. Many slave owners perceived themselves as benevolent masters who took care of their black and white family members and sold only the troublemakers. Few Southern whites questioned the morality of the domestic slave trade. The world of Southern whites. The dual cultures of the planter elite. American slavery had taken root on tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake and in the rice fields of the Carolina Low Country. It grew to maturity on the cotton fields and sugar plantations of the Mississippi Valley. Westward movement had profound impact on the approximately 3,000 wealthy planter families of Southern society. The plantation elite consisted of two groups: traditional aristocrats of the Old South and the market-driven entrepreneurs who made their wealth in the cotton industry. By 1700, tobacco and rice cultivation in the Chesapeake and Carolinas had produced a wealthy class of Southern planters who identified themselves with the English landed gentry and viewed their lives as embodiments of classical Republican values. This was their justification for practicing slavery. Most planters criticized the increasingly democratic polity and egalitarian society of the Northeast and Midwest, preferring a society led by wealthy men of talent. To maintain their identity, aristocratic planters entertained lavishly and married their sons and daughters to one another, teaching them to follow in their footsteps. As the 19th century progressed, rice planters remained at the top of the plantation aristocracy. In tobacco-growing regions, the lives of the planter aristocracy developed differently, in part based on the diffuse ownership of slaves. The ideology and reality of, quote, benevolence, unquote. Planters defended slavery as a benevolent social system and a positive good, based on Christian ideology. Slavery produced a civilized lifestyle for whites and tutelage for blacks, planters argued. Based on a desire to control their workers, extend Christian teachings, and counter abolitionism, planters increasingly intervened in the lives of their slaves, requiring them to attend religious services. Although defenders of slavery often used religious explanations to justify human bondage, many absentee owners rarely knew about the day-to-day brutality in their slaves' lives. Cotton entrepreneurs. Among the entrepreneurial slave masters, less religious justifications and more capitalistic calculations dictated treatment of slaves. Making a profit required hard work, and slaves who failed or refused to produce received severe punishment. Cotton was a demanding crop because of its long growing season, and few slaves acquired craft skills. To increase profit and efficiency, cotton planters during the 1820s began to use a gang labor system, a disciplined system by assigning work gangs, closely supervised by black drivers and white overseers. Cotton planters' use of gang labor had mixed results. The increase in cotton cultivation exhausted the soil and reduced output per acre. Still, the system produced enormous wealth for whites, approximately 4 million bales of cotton each year. Planters, smallholding yeomen, and tenants. The planter elites. Although slavery impacted all Southern society, most whites did not own slaves. In 1830, 36% of Southern whites owned slaves. By 1860, less than 25% did. Slave ownership varied by region. In the Cotton Belt, 40% of whites owned slaves compared to only 10% in the hilly Appalachian Mountains. In 1860, the richest planter families, which constituted 5% of the South's white population, held over 20 or more slaves each. Along with the rest of the Southern aristocracy, they collectively owned 50% of all slaves and grew 50% of all the South's cotton crop. Middle-class planters owned 40% of the slave population. Most pursued dual careers as skilled artisans or professional men. Lawyers, who represented the interests of slave owners, became wealthy, powerful, and influential office holders. Smallholding planters and yeomen. Smallholders usually owned 1 to 5 slaves and achieved modest prosperity through hard work and determination. Influenced by the patriarchal ideology of the planter class, these yeoman farmers ruled their small holdings and families with a firm hand. Most yeomen lived and died hard-scrabble farmers, working alongside their slaves in the field and moving regularly in search of new lands to farm. Some whites became propertyless due to debts and worked as tenant farmers for wealthy landowners. Poor freemen. Propertyless whites enjoyed few of the benefits of slavery and suffered many of its ill consequences. Although destitute, poor white men considered themselves fortunate to rank above blacks in society. Many Southern whites fled the planter-dominated area to work farms in Appalachian Hill Country and further west where they could achieve independence and respect. Expanding and governing the South. The settlement of Texas. After winning independence from Spain in 1821, the Mexican government, short on population and cash for settling the region, encouraged settlement by Mexicans and by migrants from the United States. As the Mexican government asserted greater political control over Texas in the mid-1830s, the Americans split into two groups. The Peace Party, led by Stephen Austin, wanted more autonomy for the province, and the War Party wanted independence from Mexico. After provoking a rebellion, the War Party proclaimed the independence of Texas on March 2, 1836, and adopted a constitution legalizing slavery. Vowing to put down the rebellion, Santa Anna's army wiped out the War Party's rebel garrison that was defending the Alamo and then captured Goliad. Hundreds of American adventurers, influenced by press reports and lured by offers of land grants, flocked to Texas to join the rebel army. Led by General Sam Houston, the War Party routed the Mexicans in the Battle of San Jacinto. The Mexican government abandoned efforts to reconquer Texas, but refused to accept its status as an independent republic. Texans quickly voted for annexation to the United States, but President Martin Van Buren refused to act on the issue, knowing that adding Texas as a slave state would divide the Democratic Party and the nation and almost certainly lead to war with Mexico. The politics of democracy. Despite their economic and social prominence, the slave-owning elite did not dominate the political life of the Cotton South. Planters lived in a Republican society with democratic institutions that had granted suffrage to all white men and provided for a secret ballot and apportionment based on population. Thus, they had to compete with other classes of whites for popular favor. Most elected officials were mid-level planters and planter lawyers and levied taxes on property as well as luxury goods instead of on the ordinary people. Southern Democrats endorsed low taxes to curry popular support, while Whigs advocated government support for banks, high taxes, and internal improvements. Most Southern state legislatures enacted policies that reflected the interests of the slave-owning population, but were also careful not to alienate non-slave-owning whites. The paradox of Southern prosperity. In 1860, the Southern economy ranked fourth in the world. Although white Southerners experienced a high standard of living, African Americans lived in poverty and Northern wealth was rapidly increasing. Southerners invested most of their wealth in land and slaves, neglecting economic diversification and industrial investment in favor of short-term profits. Urban growth was limited to commercial cities. Only 10% of the nation's manufactured goods were produced in the South. Few planters invested in railroads, and only to service cotton regions. Slavery worked in other ways to deter industrialization. Fearing competition from slave labor, European immigrants avoided the South, depriving the region of needed free workers to reclaim the land for development. Thus, the South remained an economic colony of Europe, and the North did not enjoy real economic independence and diversity despite outward signs of wealth and prosperity. The African-American World. Evangelical Black Protestantism. The African religions and Christian conversion is what we're going to look at first. The emergence of a black form of evangelical Christianity exemplified the synthesis of African and European culture that composed a new African American culture. Evangelical Protestantism came to the South in the late 18th century with the Second Great Awakening and the conversion of thousands of whites and blacks. Until the Second Great Awakening, the overwhelming majority of African American slaves retained an African religious culture, but white Protestant preachers and planters began to convert slaves. Many assimilated blacks crusaded for Protestantism, and after being traded to the Deep South, spread evangelical Christianity to slaves there. Enslaved blacks and unofficial black ministers reinterpreted the teachings of Christianity to meet their own needs and emphasize oneness of people and the anti-slavery ethos of Christ and God. Despite believing in a European religion, black slaves expressed their spirituality in African ways, including the use of ring shouts and the creation of a joyous brand of Protestant worship to sustain them under slavery. Forging families and communities. By 1820, most black slaves in America had been born in the United States, and the domestic slave trade had eliminated regional variations. These developments helped to create a homogeneous black culture based on evangelical Christianity, English as a common language, and labor and slave regime. Although the black population was becoming more homogeneous, African cultural influences remained important, such as dancing, marriage, and religion. Unlike white marriages, slave marriages were not recognized in law and followed African forms of union, such as jumping the broomstick. The creation of fictive kinship networks and the naming of practices for children were part of a complex community building process of order in which family and community values remained intact despite the slave trade and slavery itself. If you look at some of the languages, some examples here, pronouncing TH as DE, the. Slaves would get married but were not binding, of course, and surrogate families were often used. And also a good point here is a frequent cause of running away was to be reunited with family members, children, spouses, and the like. Negotiating rights. African Americans created a sense of order and sometimes control over their lives in an otherwise uncontrollable world. In the rice-growing slave regions, slaves used the task system to their advantage, ending work early and planting food for their own use. So the task system is completing a specific job each day. Okay? On sugar and cotton plantations, the gang labor system limited such independence, but surplus slaves hired out as teamsters, drovers, or railroad workers gained new freedoms and skills. Planters worried constantly that enslaved African Americans would rebel against them. African American passive resistance severely limited a master's power. Slaves slowed the pace of work by feigning illness, breaking tools, and running away. Fear of slave resistance reduced a white master's use of violence and increased the use of positive incentives and work discipline as control mechanisms. The violence of the slave regime, such as rape and beatings, meant that violent slave resistance was infrequent. Survival strategies. Coordinated large-scale slave revolts such as the Prosser Revolt of 1820 and Turner Revolt of 1832 were rare. Blacks realized the futility of violent resistance because they lacked communal resources to fight well-armed whites. Escape was difficult, since families would be left behind, and the distance to the north was great, leading some blacks to escape to Florida or form hidden communities in swamps and woods and intermarry with Indians. Given these limitations, most slaves created the best possible lives for themselves and their families, in part by demanding from masters a greater share of the fruits of their labor as slaves, such as the right to have a garden or time off. Even well-treated slaves did not accept the legitimacy of their status. The free black population. Some enslaved blacks found freedom through escape or manumission. In 1790, the proportion of free blacks in the total black population was 8%. Between 1820 and 1840, it became 13% and then dropped to 11% by 1860. Half of all free blacks lived in the North. Most were Southern refugees. A minority were the offspring of families that had not been free for generations. Even in the North, few free blacks enjoyed a truly free existence. Most whites viewed blacks as socially inferior economic competitors and thus confined them to low-paying menial work. In rural areas, they were farm laborers. In urban areas, they worked as domestic servants and day laborers. Only a small number owned any land. Only a few states allowed free black men to vote, attend public schools, and sit next to whites in churches. Only in Massachusetts could blacks testify against whites in court. The federal government forbade blacks from being employed in postal service, claiming public lands or holding a U.S. passport. Despite limitations, a few free blacks amassed relative wealth. Mathematician Benjamin Banneker, painter Joshua Johnston, and merchant Paul Cuffey achieved public distinction for their work for whites. To improve American institutions and give blacks a sense of autonomy, free African Americans created churches, orphanages, and fellowship groups. One of the most famous was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded by Bishop Richard Allen. Class distinctions developed in the black community based on elite appeals to white beneficence and working-class rejection of white violence and oppression. Most free blacks in the South, 225,000 in 1860, up from 94,000 in 1810, lived in large coastal cities, especially in the Upper South. Free Southern blacks consisted almost entirely of the artisan class, of skilled workers, due in part to the lack of European immigration to the South. Free Southern blacks accused of crimes were often denied a jury trial and were sometimes forced back into slavery. Some wealthy free Southern blacks distanced themselves from working-class free blacks and identified more with planter aristocracy, even owning slaves. Most free blacks, understanding the precariousness of their own lives, found racial solidarity with other blacks and worked toward the end of slavery by helping fugitive slaves, supporting the anti-slavery movement, or entering black politics. Slaves viewed them as signs of hope. Whites perceived them as a menace. So a quick review: the slave codes. Slavery as a necessary evil to a positive good. Texas and slavery and the role it played in the Texas Revolution. African American culture. Resistance to slavery. And that is it for Chapter 12. Until next time.